The night was dark, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood. King Æthelbert of Kent stood at the edge of his kingdom, watching as the flames of a distant village leapt into the sky. The year was 601, and the world was changing. Æthelbert's heart was heavy with a decision he had made, a decision that would shape the future of his people and the land they called home. Æthelbert had been a powerful king, but he knew that power was fragile. His kingdom, Kent, was one of many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms scattered across what is now England. Each kingdom had its own king, and each king sought to expand his influence and control. But Æthelbert had a unique problem. He was being pressured to convert to a new religion, Christianity, by the powerful Roman Empire. The Roman missionaries had come with the promise of a new god, a god who could bring peace and prosperity, but Æthelbert was wary. He knew that accepting this new religion could mean acknowledging the superiority of the Roman Empire, a move that could weaken his own authority. Yet he also knew that the Roman Empire was a force to be reckoned with, and he could not afford to alienate such a powerful ally. In the end, Æthelbert made his choice. He allowed the Roman missionaries to preach in his kingdom, and even converted to Christianity himself. This act created a strong bond between Æthelbert and the Roman Empire, but it also set a precedent that would influence other Anglo-Saxon kings for generations to come. Across the land, other kings faced similar dilemmas. King Riedwald of East Anglia, for example, was a powerful pagan ruler who had helped Edwin of Northumbria take the throne. Riedwald was torn between his own beliefs and the demands of his allies. He added an altar to the Christian god in his pagan temple, but stopped short of fully converting. This compromise allowed him to maintain his power and relationships, but it also left a lasting mark on his kingdom. The bonds between kings were not just religious, they were also personal. Marriage alliances were a common way to strengthen ties between kingdoms. When Tonbert of the Geirwe married Æthelthryth, the daughter of King Anna of the East Angles, he essentially surrendered his province to East Anglian control. This decision was not made lightly. Tonbert knew that his small kingdom could not stand alone against larger, more powerful neighbors. By marrying into a more influential royal family, he secured a place for himself and his people in a larger, more stable kingdom. These personal and political bonds were not always easy to navigate. In the kingdom of Mercia, for example, the Mercian kings gradually brought smaller neighboring kingdoms under their control. The Æthelwicks, for instance, were a smaller kingdom that came to power with Mercian military help. Over time, the Æthelwicksian kings were reduced to subkings and eventually to ealdormen, administrative officials who served the Mercian king. This process of annexation and integration was complex and often involved multiple layers of loyalty and obligation. The smaller kingdoms did not disappear completely when they were absorbed into larger ones. Instead, they often retained their territorial integrity and became administrative units within the larger kingdom. This preservation of earlier boundaries meant that the legacy of these smaller kingdoms lived on in the form of ealdormanries, which were administrative regions governed by appointed officials. The relationship between kings and their people was also shaped by the resources they controlled. King Alfred of Wessex, in his translation of Boethius, Consolation of Philosophy, outlined the essential resources a king needed to rule effectively. These included praying men, fighting men, and working men. The working men provided the raw materials that supported the other two groups. Kings collected tribute from the peasants who lived on their vast estates, in the form of food, goods, and labor. This tribute, known as fium, was used to feed the king's court and to reward those who served him. The king could also reward his loyal followers by granting them land. These gifts were often temporary, lasting only for the recipient's lifetime, and would return to the king upon the recipient's death. However, the introduction of Christianity brought new concepts of land tenure. The church needed permanent land grants to support its activities, and these grants, known as bookland, were recorded in charters. This new type of land tenure allowed the church to hold land indefinitely, free from the usual temporary arrangement. Kings were generous in their gifts to the church, sometimes to a fault. For example, Ceadwalla of Wessex granted a quarter of the Isle of Wight to the church, after a victory he attributed to the Christian god. These gifts, while generous, also had long-term consequences. Over time, The permanent alienation of royal lands meant that there was less land available for the king to use to reward his followers or to support the church. The complex web of personal, political, and economic relationships that bound the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms together was a delicate balance. Kings had to navigate these relationships carefully, making decisions that would affect not only their immediate power, but also the long-term stability of their kingdoms. As the night sky above Æthelbert's kingdom continued to glow with the light of distant fires, he knew that the choices he made would shape the future of his people and the land they called home. As kingdoms grew, so did the challenges of maintaining and defending them. Kings couldn't just keep giving away land to get more soldiers, as that would make them weaker in the long run. Instead, they focused on the rights they could claim over land that had already been given away. There was a lot of debate about whether land given to the church called bookland was free from all royal claims. Monks wouldn't have to serve in the army, but they still had to help the king in other ways. For example, in Mercia during the 8th century, the king started demanding more from the church, like making monks do royal labor. This didn't go over well, and church leaders like Boniface complained. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The kings would let the church off some duties but insisted on 3 main ones: military service, building bridges, and constructing fortresses. These were things that everyone, including the church, had to do by custom. These obligations helped the Mercians deal with their Welsh enemies, and later with the Vikings. King Æthelbert of Mercia made these same demands when he conquered Kent, and the system spread to other kingdoms. King Alfred of Wessex used these ideas to build a strong defense against the Vikings by organizing the army and building a network of fortified towns, burhs. The idea behind these common burdens was crucial for how kings ruled. It meant that to protect their people, kings had the right to ask for a lot from landowners. Alfred had to fight not just the Vikings, but also his own people, who sometimes resisted his demands for military service and money. Some churches even had to sell land to meet these demands. Alfred faced resistance, but eventually won important concessions, which his successors built upon to create one of the best organized governments in Europe. Kings also had to manage their own lands effectively. These lands provided them with food and drink, as well as the materials they needed for weapons and gifts. For example, the royal estate at Ramsbury in Wiltshire had evidence of iron smelting and smithing. But for things like gold, silver, and precious stones, kings had to trade with other countries. They could trade agricultural products and items like cloth, hunting dogs, hawks, and furs. Trade with the continent became more important, especially for kingdoms like Mercia and Wessex, which needed ports to participate in foreign trade. Trading centers, wicks like Hamwick in Wessex, not only handled foreign trade, but also supplied royal estates and facilitated internal trade. In the epic poem Beowulf, it's clear that a good king was one who was both wealthy and generous. Wealth helped a king win the support he needed to be powerful. However, as Tacitus noted, this system required constant warfare to maintain a large military following, and to provide the means for giving gifts. The shift from temporary land grants to permanent land with hereditary tenure helped kings break this cycle. It established that serving the king was an obligation that came with owning land, rather than something that had to be paid for continuously. This change allowed kings to focus on other aspects of ruling, though they still gave substantial rewards like the Alfred Jewel, a beautiful piece of gold and rock crystal. Royal families were not separate from the nobility. They were part of the same group. An Ætheling was any male who could trace his lineage back to the kingdom's founder. This made the royal family quite large, but it wasn't a monolithic group. Instead, it was made up of smaller, close-knit families. When a king like Cenwulf of Mercia came to power, he promoted his close relatives, giving them important roles and positions. By the 8th century, royal families had split into different lineages that competed for the throne. For example, Cenwulf's family was in competition with other lineages. If one of their members became king, the whole family benefited. This created factions within the kingdom, where different groups supported different candidates for the throne. The pattern of succession varied from kingdom to kingdom. In some, like Kent and East Anglia, the throne stayed within one family for a long time. In others, like Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, different lineages took turns. Kings who were successful in other areas, especially in expanding their territory, were better at ensuring their own family's succession. For example, Egbert and his son Æthelwulf of Wessex were able to keep the throne in their family by doubling the size of their kingdom and giving land to supporters. In Northumbria and Mercia, the dominant royal lineages of the 7th century lost power in the 8th century. This often happened when they faced military defeats or economic challenges. For example, after Egfrith's defeat at Nechtensmere, the family of Æthelfrith lost control in Northumbria. They tried to maintain power by bringing in a half-brother, Aldfrith, but when he died, his young sons couldn't take over, leading to a distant relative becoming king. Kings had to be both powerful and strategic to ensure their family's success. They used various methods, like abdicating for religious reasons, using subkings, and even crowning their sons while they were still alive. The most successful kings were those who could expand their kingdoms and use their resources to gain support. In the world of early Anglo-Saxon England, the family you were born into played a huge role in your life, especially if you were part of a royal lineage. The survival of these royal families was not a given, and many faced challenges that could lead to their downfall. One of the biggest threats was the natural tendency for families to die out. This could happen due to infertility, high infant mortality, or even because of the dangers of battle or the schemes of rivals. For example, after the death of King Edwin of Deira, his family faced a series of tragic events. One of his sons died in battle, another was murdered, and several of his grandchildren died from natural causes. This left the Deiran royal house vulnerable, and eventually it seemed to die out. The introduction of Christianity added another layer of complexity. The church had strict rules about marriage and legitimacy, which meant that some potential heirs could be disqualified from the throne. For instance, Aldfrith, a king of Northumbria, was considered by some to be illegitimate, and if he had been born a century later, he probably would not have been allowed to become king. Despite these challenges, distant relatives often managed to take the throne. This was possible because of the belief in the power of royal blood and the need for a capable ruler. Additionally, the system of multiple rule, where several kings or subkings ruled different parts of a kingdom, played a crucial role. When a kingdom expanded, it often created subkingdoms to manage newly conquered areas. These subkings were usually members of the royal family, and over time, they could form their own branches within the royal house. For example, in Mercia, Penda's son Peter ruled the Middle Angles, but his branch of the family did not last long. In contrast, Merwal, another son of Penda, passed control of the Maganseat to his sons, creating a lasting lineage. In Wessex, after the death of King Cenwalh in 673, the kingdom was divided among several subkings. This system allowed different members of the royal family to rule different areas, and sometimes these subkings could use their resources to challenge for the main throne. Caedwalla and Inni, who later became powerful kings of Wessex, were both sons of subkings. However, as time went on, the system of subkings was replaced by ealdormanries, where powerful nobles ealdormen were appointed to govern regions. These ealdormen often came from families with royal blood, and had significant military and financial resources. This made them potential threats to the king, as they could use their power to challenge for the throne. For example, in Northumbria, several ealdormen, such as Bertfrith, held positions that were almost equal to that of the king. Some ealdormen, like Æthelwold Mall and Osred II, even managed to become kings themselves. The relationship between the king and these ealdormen was often tense. Kings needed to rely on ealdormen to govern effectively, but this also meant giving up some of their power. In Mercia, kings tried to appoint their relatives as ealdormen to keep power within the family, but this was not always possible. When a king tried to remove a powerful ealdorman, it could lead to conflict and even war. Women also played a significant role in the political landscape. While they could not inherit the throne directly, they could pass on royal blood to their children. For example, Oswald's claim to the thrones of Bernicia and Deira was strengthened because his father married a Deiran princess. Similarly, the marriage of Aelfled, the daughter of King Ceolwulf of Mercia, was highly sought after because her royal blood could enhance the claims of her children to rule. Marriages between royal and noble families were strategic alliances that helped strengthen political ties. When a princess married into another kingdom, It brought new relatives into the family network, which could be used to increase control over a region. For instance, the marriage of King Æthelbert of Northumbria to Oswifu, the daughter of King Oswulf, suggested an alliance against their rivals. The conversion to Christianity had a profound impact on Anglo-Saxon society. It brought new religious practices, moral values, and legal expectations. Kings who embraced Christianity often made generous donations to churches, and sometimes even abdicated to become monks. The influence of Irish missionaries was particularly strong, and some kings were so moved by their teachings that they gave up their thrones to pursue a spiritual life. Christianity also had a political dimension. Kings used it to strengthen their influence over other kingdoms. For example, when a king converted a subject kingdom to Christianity, it created a spiritual bond that could be used to maintain control. The Christian God was seen as a powerful protector in battle, and many kings were convinced that Christian nations were more successful and prosperous. In this complex world, the balance of power between the king, the church, and the ealdormen was always delicate. Kings had to navigate these relationships carefully to maintain their authority and ensure the survival of their lineage. The relationship between kings and the church in Anglo-Saxon England was a complex dance of power, faith, and politics. At the heart of this relationship were the charters, documents that recorded the land grants kings made to the church. These charters often emphasized the spiritual benefits of such gifts, suggesting that kings were giving land to the church to save their souls. But there was more to it than just piety. Founding monasteries in newly conquered lands helped kings consolidate their power by integrating these areas into their kingdoms. If the founder of a monastery was later recognized as a saint, it could further strengthen the king's rule by creating a local hero and a focus for religious devotion. Kings also saw the value in having saintly relatives. Saintly connections not only encouraged more donations to the church, but also provided a model for the local population to follow. Female members of the royal family often played this role, but male relatives who died in battle or were murdered, like Oswald and Wigston, could also be venerated as saints. For some kings, retiring to a monastery offered a way to atone for the sins that came with ruling, and it sometimes allowed them to choose their successors. However, this path could also be a convenient way for powerful relatives to remove a king from power, as seen in the case of several Northumbrian kings who were forcibly tonsured and locked away in monasteries. The church, in turn, had to adapt to the Anglo-Saxon world to gain acceptance. Church leaders often had to accept that kings saw themselves as the heads of the church in their kingdoms, appointing bishops and making key decisions. While kings could be influenced by charismatic churchmen, there were limits to how much interference they would tolerate. Bishop Wilfrid of Northumbria learned this the hard way when he was exiled for meddling in King Egfrith's marriage, and for amassing large endowments for his monasteries. Other churchmen, like Bishop Cuthbert and Bede, took a more pragmatic approach, following Pope Gregory's advice to blend Christianity with elements of Anglo-Saxon culture to ease the transition. Despite these challenges, the church began to bring about significant changes in Anglo-Saxon society. The introduction of bookland, a new form of land tenure, allowed kings and noble families to establish their own monasteries. These monasteries, often controlled by royal women, became centers of wealth and influence. However, this concentration of land and wealth in church hands also gave the church political power, leading to conflicts within the royal families and attacks on church property. The church was also deeply involved in regulating marriage practices. King Æthelbert of Kent was nearly expelled from his kingdom for marrying his stepmother, and King Æthelbald of Mercia faced criticism for not taking a legitimate wife. The church's laws on marriage not only addressed moral issues, but also defined legitimate heirs, giving churchmen significant political influence. As the period progressed, kings showed more respect for church laws, especially in the matter of succession, often using coronation ceremonies to legitimize their rule. The Carolingian Renaissance, a period of cultural and intellectual revival in Europe, had a profound impact on Anglo-Saxon England. Kings like Offa and Alfred saw the benefits of a strong church, which emphasized the king's role as Christ's representative on earth, and demanded loyalty from his subjects. In exchange, these kings used their power to protect the church and promote Christian values. Offa, in particular, was praised for establishing good customs among the Mercians and for presiding over church synods, which helped reinforce his political dominance. However, the relationship between church and state was not always smooth. Churchmen inspired by the Carolingian ideals sometimes challenged royal authority, particularly over the control of proprietary monasteries. This tension led to conflicts, such as the Mercian king's attempts to take over the monasteries of the Hwicks in Kent, which were ultimately thwarted by opposition from church leaders. The West Saxon kings, including Alfred, were also interested in acquiring church lands. Alfred, for example, took over the former monastery of Abingdon and its lands, a move that drew criticism from the church. However, Alfred's efforts to defend his kingdom against Viking invasions and his recruitment of churchmen from outside his kingdom helped him gain forgiveness for his exactions. Over time, his virtues were seen to outweigh his vices, and he was remembered as a model of a Christian king. In the end, the interaction between kings and the church in Anglo-Saxon England was a dynamic and evolving relationship. Both sides recognized the benefits of cooperation, but also the need to assert their own interests. The legacy of this relationship shaped the political and religious landscape of medieval England, leaving a lasting impact on the nation's history.